So today we're talking about Vernon County trout streams. Here are the trout surveys I have from Vernon County, Wisconsin. I haven't posted one of these videos, I guess, in like a week, but it seems like it's been longer since I made one of these videos. I've only fished a few streams before in Vernon County. It's like 2 hours from where I live at in Lodi, Wisconsin, so it's a bit of a drive. So I have not ventured there very often. There are lots of trout streams in this county, and there are some very popular trout streams in the driftless area in this county. And as with previous videos, this data was collected using backpack and like a stream shocker, which is like a barge that people pull up a stream and shock with, and people walk behind who is shocking and net the trout, and they shock a certain distance, and so people try to attempt to net every trout that they shock up over a distance. And then they use that as an indication of an abundance of trout in the stream. And if there is not brook trout or brown trout listed in the stream survey data, that means none were caught in the surveys on that stream. And I have categorized brook trout as brook trout per mile, brook trout over 10 inches per mile, the pounds of brook trout per mile, and the maximum size brook trout per mile. And I've categorized brown trout as brown trout per mile, brown trout over 12 inches per mile, brown trout over 16 inches per mile, and brown trout pounds per mile, and brown trout and maximum size that was caught in the survey. So we'll start off with this. The first stream is the West Fork of the Kickapoo River. I did try fishing this stream once. I think we caught a few brown trout when me and my friend fished it, but that was probably in like 2012, so that was a long time ago. And I also think I was trying to cross where there was a big bend, and I went over my waders in water trying to cross the stream to get out a snake. It's a pretty decent sized stream in parts. Other parts of it are smaller. It has both brook and brown trout in it. It has a high number of brook trout, I think, in the upper part of the stream where the one survey was taken, and the lower parts of the stream have a good population of brown trout. And the pounds per mile is pretty good for brown trout. So this is a stream that's worthwhile trying. It doesn't have the highest population of brown trout per mile, but it definitely has plenty of brown trout per mile and plenty of brook trout per mile. But the largest brown trout that was caught was 16.7 inches, and the largest brook trout that was caught was 12.4 inches. The next stream is West Branch of Baraboo River. I have fished the Baraboo River before, but I fished the Baraboo River before in Sauk County, where it's a warm water stream, and all we caught were smallmouth bass, I think. But we fished it I fished it right by Baraboo. But in Vernon County, in the way upper part of it, there's quite a few brook trout in the stream, and there's some brown trout in the stream. And they caught some all right sized brook trout. The largest one was 12.9 inches caught in the surveys. But I have never fished it for trout, but if you want to catch brook trout, this would be a creek you might want to try. The next stream is Weister Creek. I have no idea about this stream. This stream has a lot of little brown trout in it and some brook trout in it. So this is a stream you might want to try. I don't think that the fish that they caught were not very large fish though, although the pounds per mile is decent in some of the surveys. The next creek is Otter Creek. This stream has a few brown trout and a few brook trout in it. I'm assuming that's actually a decent population of brown trout because I think this is a smaller stream, but I really don't know anything about this creek. I was just comparing this to other surveys. So I don't know how to grade this stream. The pounds per mile is not very high though, so most of brown trout are relatively small. The next creek are the top secret creeks. They're so top secret they don't even have a name. Some of these creeks have a lot of fish in them though, so if you can figure out where these top secret creeks are, you might want to go and try fishing them. The next creek is where there's a lot of dill growing, and this creek, that stream just has a few brown trout in it, and they are small. The next creek is another unnamed or secret creek name, and this stream has a good amount of brown trout in it and some brook trout, although most of the fish are pretty small. The next creek is Rundahl Creek. This stream has a lot of brown trout in it, and the brown trout in this stream are very small, and a couple brook trout. The next creek is Warner Branch, and Warner Branch has a few brown trout and a few brook trout in it, and the brown trout were really small. The brook trout were a little larger. This creek is one of the most well-known creeks in the driftless area, and they constantly have different experimental regulations. I've never fished it before, but I know this is a very popular creek in the driftless area. This stream has a lot of brown trout in it and a few brook trout. It has a lot of small to medium-sized brown trout. There's a few larger brown trout. As you can see in the survey, I think the largest ones they caught was like 17 inches, unless it's ones that's behind my face, which I need to move out of this video when I finish editing it. But this creek has a lot of fish in it, and you can see by the pounds per mile. The pounds per mile is pretty high compared to other streams, so it has a lot of adult fish, although not necessarily like 15 to 20 inches. Here's more surveys for on Timber Cooley Creek, and they caught a lot of brown trout again, but I don't think they caught any that were particularly huge, and a couple brook trout. But this is probably a creek you want to try fishing, although it'll probably have higher fishing pressure than a lot of these other creeks I'm mentioning. But it also has high numbers of fish. The next creek is Tenney Spring Creek. This creek has both brook trout and brown trout in it. None of the brown trout are had a spectacular size. The brook trout, some of the brook trout were over 10 inches. So this might be a creek to fish for action, but I don't know what it's like. Next creek is Tainter Creek. This stream has both brook trout and brown trout in it. It has an alright population of both species in it. The largest brown trout was 15.6 inches and largest brook trout was 10.4 inches, which is alright size, but is not huge. The next creek is Springville Branch, and this stream has a good population of brown trout in it, and the largest brown trout they caught was 18.6 inches, and it has a couple brook trout. The next creek is South Fork Bad Axe River, and I did try fishing this creek once, and I caught a bunch of little brown trout. It's a nice looking creek. There's a wide variety of habitat. It's kind of it has a steeper gradient than a lot of the driftless creeks I'm used to fishing, but it also has some deep pools. It has some runs or some riffles, a little bit of everything structure wise. This stream has a lot of brown trout in it and a couple brook trout. So this is definitely a creek you might want to try too. Here's more surveys on the South Fork of the Bad Axe River. And in these surveys at this one spot, they caught more brook trout than in the previous location, which is probably farther upstream in the creek where the creek is smaller. But they also caught a lot of brown trout in the surveys. And they caught some all right sized fish, but not a lot of big brown trout. But this is definitely a good creek to go to for action. The next creek is South Branch Creek, and this stream has a few brown trout in it. They did catch a 19.1 incher though, which is a good size one for these streams. Next creek is South Bear Creek. This stream has a decent population of brook trout and a lot of brown trout in it. So this is a creek you might want to try. I have no idea what it looks like, but it's another creek you might want to try. Next creek is Sidie Creek. And this creek has both brook trout and brown trout in it. It has an alright population of both. And the largest brook trout was 9.5 inches and the largest brown trout was 17.7 inches. Next creek is Sherry Creek. This stream has a lot of trout in it, both brook trout and brown trout, although the size of the brown trout is really small. I'm assuming this is some little tributary stream to some larger creek that has a lot of fish in it, but I could be wrong. But if you want to catch tiny trout, this would be a spot to try. The next creek is Seymour Creek, and this creek doesn't have a whole lot of fish in it, but it has both brown and brook trout. Next creek is Seas Branch Creek. I think I might have fished this creek before, and I think we caught some browns. It was when everything was really flooded though, and a lot of the areas you couldn't really fish because the water was so high. I know they're trying to protect it for brook trout. We fish in the lower part of it, now we caught our brown trout, but I think in the upper part of it there's more brook trout, and they're trying to protect it for brook trout. Next creek is Rullands Cooley Creek. And this stream also is in Monroe County. This stream has a lot of brown trout in it, but not many large brown trout. Next creek is Reeds Creek. Reeds Creek has a few brook trout in it and a lot of brown trout in it. And the brown trout are not particularly large. The next stream is the Pine River. This stream also is in Richland County. And I don't know if I actually have even fished the Pine River in Richland County. I know I fished tributaries of the Pine River, but I don't actually think I fished on the Pine River. I've just driven over it. And here they caught some brook trout and brown trout, but this is the way upper part of the Pine River where it's really small. The next creek is where the fish are getting eaten by a lot of fish-eating predators, but there's still quite a few trout that have escaped from the otters. And Otter Creek has a lot of brown trout and some brook trout in it, although the size of brown trout's not large. Next stream is North Fork of Bad Axe River, and this stream has a lot of trout, and it has a good number of brook trout at the one spot, and a lot of brown trout at that spot. And some of the other spots it also has a lot of brown trout and some brook trout. And here's more surveys on the North Fork of the Bad Axe River, and at the Park Road spot they really caught a lot of fish, so there's probably some structure or deep habitat there. But this is definitely a creek you'd want to try. I'm sure you'll catch lots of brown trout up to 14 or 15 inches and some brook trout, but you might be lucky and catch the 18.1 incher that's swimming around. But it's definitely a spot you want to try. Next creek is North Bear Creek. North Bear Creek has both brook trout and brown trout in it. It has an okay population of both, but it doesn't have a huge population, a really high population of both. I assume this isn't a very large creek, but I could be completely wrong. The next creek is Melachthon Creek, and I have fished this creek, although it probably was in Richland County, and all I caught in Richland County in this creek was brown trout. But in Vernon County, which is farther upstream in this creek, there's a lot more brook trout in the surveys. And there's regulations on the stream to protect brook trout. And this stream has a wide variety of habitat anyways. In the parts of it I fish, there's some deep pools, shallow run riffle habitats. It's a good looking stream. The next stream is Mapledale Creek, and I'm assuming there are probably some maple trees along it. And this creek has a lot of brown trout and some brook trout in it. The max size of the brown trout was not very large though. The next stream is Lindahl Creek, and this stream has brown trout in it and brook trout, although none of the fish are very large. The next stream is Knapp Creek. I think, is this creek stream in both like Vernon and Crawford in Richland County? This is a different Knapp Creek. Anyways, this stream has some brown and brook trout in it, but it doesn't have a super high population of fish. Next creek is the Kickapoo River. And I don't know why they only had one surveys where they found trout in here, but this is a big stream. It's a bigger, larger river that a lot of these trout streams flow into. I'm sure people catch some larger browns out of it. And farther upstream, I would assume there would be a decent population of brown trout, but the one survey which I found had a few brown trout in it with no spectacular size. The next creek is Hornby Creek. Hornby Creek has a lot of brown trout in it and a couple brook trout in it. And the largest brown trout they caught was 14 inches though. Next creek is Hasley Creek. Hasley Creek has brown trout in it, but they're all really small. Next stream is Harrison Creek. Harrison Creek has brown trout in it, and the max size brown trout is 15.2 inches, which was caught. Next stream is where there's elk walking around. Actually, I doubt you'd see an elk down there. There could be an occasional straggler there, but this Elk Creek has a good population of brown trout in it, but the max size was 15.9 inches, which was caught. The next creek is Day Creek, and Day Creek has both brook trout and brown trout, and although this number of fish per mile is not above average, but the largest sized brown trout was 11.2 inches, and the largest sized brook trout was 7.5 inches, so it doesn't have a lot of very large fish in it. Next stream is Cox Creek. Cox Creek has a good population of brook trout and a few brown trout, and the largest sized brook trout that was caught was 12.3 inches, and the largest sized brown trout was 14.6 inches. The next creek is Cooley Creek, and Cooley Creek has both brook trout and brown trout in it. And it has about probably slightly above average population of brown trout per mile. And the largest brown trout they caught was 16.9 inches, and the largest brook trout that they caught was 12.4 inches. Next creek is Cooley Creek, but Coulee is spelled different than how it is in the creeks that are like Timber Coulee. And Cooley Creek has both brook trout and brown trout, and it has more brown trout than brook trout. The largest brook trout that was caught in these surveys was 11.6 inches, and the largest brown trout that was caught was 13.4 inches. So the fish in Cooley Creek are not very large fish though. The next creek is Cook Creek, and Cook Creek has both brook trout and brown trout in it. The largest size brown trout was 15.8 inches, and the largest size brook trout was 10.6 inches, and it has a high population of brown trout, an above average population of brown trout. And it probably has an average or slightly above average population of brook trout per mile compared to these other streams. Champion Valley Creek has a few brook trout in it. And no brown trout, and the largest brook trout was 9.2 inches, but there's only one survey. Brush Creek, I'm sure Brush Creek is impossible to fish because it's called Brush Creek, so I assume you're walking through brush when you fish it. Actually, I've never been there before, but Brush Creek in this survey only had a few brook trout and a few brown trout. So it doesn't have a lot of fish in it either, based on this survey. So you probably don't want to, it's probably not worth dealing with the brush. The next creek is Bishop Branch, and I did fish this creek once, and we caught a whole bunch of little tiny brown trout, or brown trout up to like 12 or 14 inches. And this stream has a lot of brown trout in it, and a few brook trout in it. And I think a lot of it was relatively shallow and fast, like run riffle habitat, and maybe a few pools, but not a lot of pools. And the next creek is Beaver Creek, and the beavers have dammed up a lot of the water and caused it to get warm, so there's not very many trout in Beaver Creek. Actually, I doubt the beavers have done that. I'm just saying that to be silly. Anyways, this stream just has a few brook trout in it. And the next creek is Billings Creek. And Billings Creek, I have been by there when I camped at Wildcat Mountain State Park a while ago, but I haven't fished it in recent times. But I thought it did look good a long time ago when we were there. And this stream has a good population of brown trout in it and some brook trout. So this is definitely a stream you'd want to try, although the max size brown trout's only 15.4 inches. And here's the source.